At the outset, I'd like to thank Byju's for inviting me again to speak about the post COVID challenges to India's national security. In a way, perhaps it would be fair to say that we are not yet in the post COVID phase for two reasons. One is that the vaccine, while it does look promising, it is yet to be administered in a manner that would make a difference as far as the Indian population is concerned. So, post COVID is an aspiration. The whole world and India are hoping that there would be a very swift movement towards the post COVID phase and that this will happen sooner rather than later in 2021. The second reason why we need a little bit of caution about the post COVID status is that in the last few weeks, literally, there was talk about a new strain of the virus. It was detected first in the United Kingdom, and all the experts are agreed that amongst its other characteristics, the spread of the pandemic is considered to be greater in the new variant than the original COVID, if you will, that the world was getting more aware of starting from early 2020. So, these are two reasons why I think we have to be a little cautious about the post COVID status, which, as I said, is an aspiration. And we have not yet reached that particular point, but we must prepare for the equivalent of a post COVID phase or a post COVID context, definitely as far as India is concerned. Now, a couple of broad observations, I think, when we talk about COVID and 2021. I'll come back to COVID and what it has done to India in a few moments. But I think a few observations about the relevance of 2021. India and the world would be entering the third decade of the 21st century very soon. And what is significant for us in India is the fact that in this decade, starting 2021, India would be celebrating its 75th Independence Day anniversary in August 2022. In all likelihood, the run up will start from 2021 itself. And this particular period, 21 to 22, would mark, as I said, a very important milestone for India, 75 years of a free India. And there are many achievements that India has reason to be proud of. And the demography of India, with all its diversity, all its characteristics, is something that is to be acknowledged, something to be valued, and something that has to be nurtured in the most normative and positive way. So I think there is a salience about 2021 as we march into the third decade that we must keep in mind. And the entity of India, with all its characteristics, of which diversity and pluralism is a very important aspect, is to be nurtured in, as I said, normative way, in a positive way, in the way that India was envisioned. And I think we have to recall that Prime Minister Modi recently, when he had addressed the Aligarh Muslim University, he had made reference to the same characteristics of India, the pluralism, and the fact that there are many traits about India that need to be acknowledged from August 1947 to where we are now. And in many ways, it is the spirit of India. Everything else that we associate with India, which in a way is linked to national security. Because when we talk about national security, I think with the experience of the COVID with us, we have to look at it now in its most comprehensive and holistic manner and acknowledge some of the changes that have taken place about our understanding of national security. Not like any state, when India became independent in August 1947, the most important requirement at that time for a nascent India, when we had Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru at the helm of affairs, was to consolidate the Indian state, which means its territorial integrity. And there were challenges to India's territorial integrity starting from October of 1947 in relation to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Now, it is one of those, I would say, features about the Indian experience that what began in October 1947 in relation to Jammu and Kashmir and the way in which the newly born state of Pakistan had embarked upon a path of violence, both by the use of irregulars, what were the equivalent of the first Mujahideen, as also the use of its own army, was a challenge in October 1947, and it is something that India is dealing with even at the end of 2020. So I think this is one of the features that when we talk about national security and India, territorial integrity is something that remains an abiding concern, not just in relation to Pakistan and Kashmir, but we are aware that in 2020, India and China had a very, very unsatisfactory experience in summer of 2020, what is called as the Galwan incident, where for the first time in 3 decades, the Indian Army lost 20 brave soldiers. It's called the Galwan incident. And from there to now, as India has repeatedly said, the Indian Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, has made this observation that the bilateral relationship between India and China is now profoundly disturbed. And currently, even as we speak, the two militaries, that of India and China, are in a very uneasy standoff in Ladakh along the line of actual control, where both sides have their own claim lines and the way in which these are being currently defended. It is an uneasy situation, but what it points to is the fact that for India, territorial integrity and the fact that it remains contested is still a very, very serious national security challenge. But again, this is not the only challenge to India's comprehensive national security. And this is where I think 2021 is going to pose a number of interrelated challenges to India's ability to deal with the complex set of challenges that have now arisen as far as the national security radar is concerned. Let me spend a few minutes and talk about COVID and what it has done to the notion of security. Not just in India, but globally, I think it would be fair to say that policymakers the world over and the political leadership is now reviewing the notion of national security. It cannot be oblivious to the human dimension and the way in which all the major states have, in a way, found this to be a very daunting challenge is reflected in the numbers. For instance, the world's most prosperous and powerful state, the United States of America, when you look at the kind of damage that the COVID pandemic has done to the United States, it is very, very stark. And at one level, I would say it's an illustration of the complexities that the world has to now deal with, which is that despite the fact that the United States is considered to be militarily the most powerful nation in the world, we have a situation where in 2020, America has lost more than 1 million of its citizens to this particular pandemic. And more alarmingly, I think the way in which the pandemic has spread in the United States is cause for very deep concern. And as and when the new president, Mr. Joe Biden, assumes office, I think this is going to be the most significant challenge for him, along with, as I said, other countries. The United States was being identified because it makes the point that however strong you may be militarily, today public health and the security and safety of the citizen has become a very, very important aspect of national security. And in the Indian case, again, the experience, while it has not been as extreme as the case of the United States, there is, I would say, a fairly heavy price that India has paid, meaning that if you look at the overall figures, more than 10 million cases have been reported in terms of the total number of citizens who have tested positive for COVID. And the number of people who lost their lives is over 14 lakhs. Even as we speak, the numbers are increasing. And while it is cause for satisfaction that the number of deaths per million are still in the equivalent of 106 to 110, the number is increasing, as I said, on a daily basis. It is not as extreme as some of the other countries in the world. In a regional context, we have to acknowledge that when you look at the South Asian neighbors, whether it's a Pakistan, a Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, their number of deaths per million are much lower than that of India. And I think this has to be kept in mind when we talk about how India has dealt with the COVID pandemic, purely in terms of numbers and how many citizens have lost their lives. But at the same time, I do want to say that if you look at the scale of India, the demography and the diversity of India, I think after the initial kind of shock about the pandemic, the infrastructure has been put into place. And today, whether it is in terms of tracking those who travel or trying to provide the equivalent of efficient and reliable testing, and also deal with the new variant, India and its digital effort is something that has been acknowledged. And I think we can only hope that as we go along into 2021, the resilience that India has shown in dealing with this challenge would be seen to be adequate to contain what could be a very serious challenge. Now, this is as far as the human dimension is concerned. I want to spend a couple of minutes and talk about the economic impact of the COVID pandemic. Some of the images, of course, are very stark. We all recall that in the early months, we had a situation where a large number of people in India, particularly those who were classified as migrant workers, were going back to their respective homes in different parts of India. And we had this image, as I said, of a steady stream of people leaving urban centers, whether it was a Delhi or a Mumbai or a Bangalore or wherever. And the fact that they were in a very, very difficult situation, walking home in many cases, without any kind of support at that point in time is something that would remain as one of the most traumatic experiences of the COVID and 2020. But this has translated into some very, very, I would say, challenging numbers when we look at the Indian economy. So let me now briefly touch upon the Indian economy in relation to what the COVID experience has done as far as the macroeconomic situation is concerned. Again, I think we must keep in mind the fact that it is cause for some satisfaction that despite what the COVID has done to the global economy and India, today the experts are of the view that by the time we come to the period 2027 to 2030, there would be a rearrangement of the global economic ladder, which is that around 27-28, China is likely to emerge as the world's number one GDP. That is, the most prosperous country in the world by way of gross domestic product. The United States is going to be a number two. And by the time we come to 2030, which means within the decade, from 21 to 30 is 9 years, India would be the world's number three GDP based on current indicators and as is often said, all things being equal in terms of the current patterns and projections of growth. Now, this is something that is, I think, cause, as I said, for satisfaction, and India must endeavor to evolve and follow those policies that would allow it to reach this particular status. sooner than 2030 if that is possible. But at the same time, I would like to underline this fact that as India becomes more prosperous in terms of macroeconomic indicators, it has to keep in mind the safety and security of its most vulnerable citizens. Therefore, per capita income and all the other human development indicators. There is a UN metric, there is a national metric, whether we talk about education, literacy, life, nutrition, all these would also have to be kept in mind as India progresses, both in terms of national prosperity and individual well being. And this is something that is also, in a way, internalized in the concept of Yoga Kshema, something that is referred to in the Arthashastra by Chanakya, where it is said repeatedly that the ultimate responsibility of those who govern in the modern context and the emperor and his own advisors in the old context, Mauryan context that Chanakya was writing, that the Yogakshema or the well-being of the citizen is a very, very significant attribute about overall national security and both duty and responsibilities as they devolve upon those who are entrusted with the act of governance. So I think for India, that's an equally important reminder that while India may move up in national prosperity, we have to ensure that the most vulnerable citizen is not left behind. And in many ways, there is a Gandhian, I would say, element also here, that the last tear has to be wiped. And currently, there are many tears in India on many faces for a variety of reasons, and I think this is something that needs to be acknowledged. But let me get back to macroeconomic indicators and how they will have a bearing on national security. One very stark indicator is that end of 2020, there were various estimates about how India's GDP is going to pan out in the financial year 2020 to 21, which will end in March 2021. It began on 1st April 2020. And the received wisdom is that the Indian economy is going to shrink by anything between 7 to 9%. Earlier, there was an estimate that it would be almost 10%, upwards of 10% in terms of the contraction or the shrinking. Now, the expert opinion is that it may not be that bad, but yet the shrinkage of GDP may be around 7.5%, which is quite significant. Now, this is going to have a very severe downstream effect, particularly in terms of India's management of its own public finances. There would be a deficit that India would have to manage in terms of both the overall deficit at the national level, as also, I think, the availability of funds for the equivalent of development and defense, both of which are in dire need as we go into 2021. Now, when you have an economy that is contracted by whatever percentage, 6%, 7%, it has had a very, very negative effect on not only the equivalent of the corporate sector, the small scale sector, the unorganized sector, all of whom have been differently affected. So we are talking about the equivalent of the small shopkeeper to the largest corporates who have all taken a beating in different ways, but also the individuals who are working, whether it is the unorganized sector, which is India's largest sector, or it is the agricultural sector, where we are looking at the equivalent of a very significant protest by the farmers of India, some farmers in some parts of India, because of how they are looking at the changes that are being brought about, or the rest of the small scale sector, corporate India, all of them, and the people who work with them have been very adversely impacted. And therefore, livelihood is something that has taken a severe beating. And in 2021, a fair amount of development effort would have to be directed. And apart from the business and the livelihood issues, we also have young India. That is, those who are in schools and colleges and universities. Many people who are perhaps listening to Byju's videos are part of this particular segment, whereby education has been disrupted And that is a sector that would also have to be addressed, because at the end of the day, the younger generation and their education is a very important strand of national security in the long term. So, my broad point is that there are a number of areas related to defense and development where India would need funding, and that funding is not available because of the COVID. So, it's a very difficult challenge for the government of India to find the resources to, in a way, kickstart the growth effort and hope that that industrial, agricultural, manufacturing, in the service sector, whatever be the kind of traction, the kind of growth that we are hoping for, would add to a revenue stream, and that becomes a virtuous cycle whereby India's own growth will progressively move up. By and large, the whole world is optimistic about India. So I think that is a very, very positive sign, because India has its fundamentals in terms of its demography, in terms of the overall index, or the overall, I would say, environment for India is something that is currently favorable and positive. So we all hope that from 21 onwards, the growth cycle will progressively become more robust. But till we reach that point, I think this challenge about how does India manage its very, very depleted resources, both for the development effort, which includes everything, including human security, and defense, is going to be a very major challenge. And this is where I want to shift gears and talk about the challenge for India in terms of its traditional security challenges as we move into 2021, and the various allocations have to be done for India and its national security purely in terms of the military component. Now, when we talk about India's traditional challenges in a purely military sense, I think we have to again recall some important developments that have taken place. The Modi government is to be commended, because looking at the complexity of India's security challenges, the Modi government took a very important step, which is that on January 1st, 2020, it created the post of a CDS, or Chief of Defence Staff. And General Bipin Rawat, who was the army chief before Jan 1st, 2020, he retired in end December 2019, was appointed as India's first CDS, Chief of Defence Staff. And this was a welcome step, because there was no doubt that India had to move towards a greater level of integration, jointness, harmonization, and tri-service integration of assets. And this seemed to be the first step in that particular direction. It had been recommended many years ago, but for a variety of reasons, previous governments were not able to take the step. So I think structurally, we have to acknowledge and recognize that this was a very important policy decision that the government of India had taken on Jan 1st, 2020. Now in March, the COVID, struck. And from then to now, India has been coping with it. And as I said earlier, in June of 2020, we had the Galwan experience. And from then onwards, the China factor, or the challenge from China in Ladakh along the line of actual control, is a very immediate, urgent tactical issue. But it also has long-term strategic implications, which is, how does India manage China? Now, that is something that India would have to live with, not just for 2021, but almost for eternity, because India and China are large neighbors in Asia, and they have lived with each other as neighbors for thousands of years, from 4,000, 5,000 years ago to where we are now. And this, of course, as I said, is for the long term, for eternity really. What do we do in terms of the immediate challenges? India has to increase its comprehensive national strength. And here I think we have to distinguish between acquiring and consolidating comprehensive national strength and projecting it as power when required. So there is a certain transformation that takes place, or a transmutation, from comprehensive national strength to comprehensive national power, which would be exuded, or you would have to project it as required depending on the exigency. And we are dealing with the China challenge at this point in time. But there is the larger dimension that India would have to contend with, and that comes in many forms, as I would explain as we go along. The second abiding challenge for India, which I referred to in my opening remarks, is the Pakistan factor, which again is something that is likely to be on the Indian radar for a long time, which is that for its own internal domestic reasons, we have seen how Pakistan has evolved, wherein after 1971 and the war for Bangladesh, starting from that decade onwards, which is again almost 50 years plus, Pakistan and its military have, in a way, envisioned themselves as being the equivalent of an anti India entity, meaning that for Pakistan and the army in particular, projecting India as an enemy, as an adversary, has become the kind of cohesion for the idea of Pakistan. Now, that's a complex kind of sociological and political kind of subject. I won't get into that just now, except to make the point that if you look at Pakistan after the birth of Bangladesh, in many ways, the two nation theory was stood on its head. Because what Bangladesh demonstrated was that religion was not enough to hold any state together. And in Pakistan's case, the Bengali nationalism became the predominant characteristic, not Islam, as Pakistan imagined. And therefore, Bangladesh, to its credit, in the last 50 odd years, has carved out a very, very enviable identity, and its own trajectory and its development indicators are very impressive. And I think for Pakistan, this has been a complete rejection of the basis on which Pakistan was created, the two nation theory. So, consequently, much of Pakistan's energy, particularly in terms of how the elite has framed the idea of Pakistan, has been in opposition to India. And as a result, starting from 1990 onwards, when we had the tragic expulsion, the exodus of the Kashmiri Pandits from the state of Jammu and Kashmir, to where we are now, the beginning of the war, terror war against India, whereby for India the external challenge of Pakistan overlapped into the internal challenge for India in terms of its internal security, and religion became an instrument. And you saw the beginning of the jihadi fervor starting from the early 90s, and it has differently manifested itself in relation to the Indian security experience. And of course, the most stark and the one that we often remember or we will recall is what happened in Mumbai in November 2008, where you had a group of terrorists who were enabled by the Pakistani state to come to Mumbai and carry out the attack that they did. And this, as I said, is an illustration of the orientation of the Pakistani army and all the other groups that we see operating. Different names, whether you have the LET, you have the JEM, and the support that they have been receiving continuously. And this is not just India. As again, the Indian Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, has repeatedly pointed out, in the region, today we are seeing what is happening in Afghanistan, where in the month of December alone, 2020, notwithstanding all the peace talks and the negotiations that have been taking place between the Kabul government and the Taliban, on a daily basis almost, there's been violence and bloodshed in Afghanistan. And again, experts are agreed that the Pakistan element in supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan is very, very evident, and regrettably, the state of Pakistan has not been able to either contain or deal with this challenge. And again, there is a certain consensus that the Pakistani deep state, as it is called, is tacitly encouraging and enabling the ecosystem to work in this manner. And most recently, there is a very famous US journalist called Daniel Pearl, and his case, he was assassinated by these terror groups, and the case went to court. And as recently as the last week of December, the assassins, the suspects, were released by a Pakistani court at the provincial level, and that is something that is being contested. But my reason for drawing attention to that is to say that the orientation in Pakistan is not one of trying to acknowledge and deal with these terror groups, but tacitly allow them. And Prime Minister Imran Khan has been, I think, responsible for allowing this particular orientation to grow. And there are many complex developments happening within Pakistan, its army, and that cumulatively is going to add to the challenge as far as India is concerned. So the broad point is that for India, as we go into 2021, both China and Pakistan will be serious security challenges. On occasion, they would be direct threats. And therefore, India needs to build on its military strength to be able to project that power when required. And that is where the COVID experience is likely to provide or present a very serious fiscal challenge, meaning that because the GDP is shrinking, it has shrunk already in terms of the spectrum of challenges and threats that have now arisen. A very stark example, for instance, when we look at the current deployment of the Indian Army along with the Air Force, as far as Ladakh is concerned, we are going to need a very, very high order of logistics. Whether we talk about winter clothing, we talk about ammunition, we talk about all the other logistical requirements, including the air support by helicopters, would be under stress. And therefore, infusion of new equipment, new inventory is critical. But the coffers are not as robust as they ought to be. And this, to my mind, is going to pose a very serious challenge in terms of India, how India will manage its challenges. Therefore, optimization and the new effort that the government is making by way of rearranging, reorganizing, is something that is very, very imperative and urgent. But we are still not quite sure how this will actually pan out because this is a work in progress. There is talk that India is now going to move towards theatre commands. Recently, there was a mention that the Maritime Command would be the first command, theatre command, to be put into place, and that would be followed by an Air Defence Command. Now, these, as I said, are still the equivalent of, a work in progress kind of situation, but we have to see whether or not this would enable India to deal with its security challenges as they emerge. Now, let me make a point that I have stressed in the past, which is that when we talk about the military challenge in terms of how these are to be identified, it's a very, very wide spectrum for a country like India, whereby the bandwidth of military security challenges move from the macro to the equivalent of the micro. And I will try and give a broad sense about how that is going to be manifest or how that might emerge when we talk about the post-COVID context for India. Now, let me recap briefly that when we talk about military security challenges for a country like India, the bandwidth spreads or the span is from macro security, that is weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons, missiles, satellites, all the kinds of capabilities that could have a macro destructive impact. A nuclear weapon is a good example, would be brought under what I would classify as a strategic capability or something that is macro in terms of its impact. Now, there are a certain number of countries in the world that have the WMD capability, and India demonstrated its own nuclear weapon capability in May of 1998 when Prime Minister Vajpayee had embarked upon the Shakti tests. From then to now, India has consolidated its own weapons of mass destruction status, which is the nuclear weapon and the missile. But we are also aware that India is living in a neighborhood where both China and Pakistan also have this capability. And the challenge for India is that while the world is aware of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as the two instances where the nuclear weapon was used, Pakistan and China, I would say together, have now done a departure from the traditional use or the traditional role of the nuclear weapon. And starting from the early 90s, Pakistan in particular has used the nuclear weapon to increase or enhance its space to engage in terrorism. So, this is something that I have in the past described as NWET, which is nuclear weapon enabled terror. And China has been complicit in encouraging, supporting Pakistan to go down this path. So for India, the WMD challenge is very, very complex. And there is no other country in the world, I repeat, there is no other country in the world that has this kind of a regional configuration of having two nuclear capable neighbors whose orientation is adversarial, and where terrorism is also one of the aspects or one of the manners in which the nuclear capability is being used. And therefore, for India, the complexity of the security challenges that we have to straddle from the macro through the traditional, which is the Army, Navy, Air Force equivalent, and the conventional threats like territorial integrity, the Indian Army, the Indian Air Force, as far as the land borders are concerned, and the Indian Navy in terms of what is happening in the Indian Ocean, as also the entire global maritime domain, where again India has been trying to maintain not only its presence but also be part of a regional effort at enhancing security and stability in the Indian Ocean. Again, we come back to a very interesting kind of formulation by Prime Minister Modi, which is SAGAR, that is security and growth for all in the region as far as the Indian Ocean is concerned. Now, these are the traditional security compulsions for any country. And as I said earlier, India is currently in a difficult position because of the fiscal pressures in the post-COVID context. I mean, earlier I used to talk about the lower end of the spectrum, but I think that is not the most appropriate way of qualifying it. At the other end is the equivalent of micro security, which is a combination of low intensity conflict, internal security, criminality, various other forms of violence that degrade the security of the state and the citizen. Therefore, terrorism is a very, very important, I would say, feature of this low intensity conflict, internal security, and related issues. And the real challenge for India is that it is not a linear bandwidth. There is a non-linear linkage where the WMD aspect, as I said earlier, the nuclear, is entangled with terrorism, and therefore it is a very complex grey kind of ecosystem where India has to navigate and manage and ensure not only territorial integrity but also the safety and security of the citizen. Now, here I want to spend a couple of minutes and say that apart from the fact that we spoke about China, we spoke about Pakistan and the other traditional elements of the national security compulsion or the national security challenge, in relation to India's internal security, we also have LWE, that is left-wing extremism. Some parts of India have been dealing with this for decades. It is a serious issue. It's also related to the development effort of the country, and that there are certain pockets, where left-wing extremism has grown. It is being dealt with, but it does exist. I do not think that we can not acknowledge the fact that LWE is a challenge for India's composite national security. Related to that, there are two other, I would say, elements, or not elements, but two other aspects of the internal security challenge. One is related to the Northeast, where while on balance, on the whole, the overall stability is increasing, the Northeast has a political process that is still dynamic. And some states, I think the consolidation has not been as robust. And we have had various groups that are seeking different forms of autonomy, or they are engaged in certain acts that are detrimental to regional security. But I think going back, these are issues that started with Pandit Nehru when he was Prime Minister. Now we have Prime Minister Modi dealing with them. So the Northeast has got its own specific set of internal security issues. LWE is broadly confined to central India. There are some states which have had a higher incidence of LWE. I've got some interesting figures. Towards the end of 2020, if you look at LWE, left-wing extremism, Chhattisgarh as a state had the highest incidence of what we call as the encounter between the security forces and the left-wing extremists. In the last 7 years, in reply to a question, it was indicated that 533 extremists slash terrorists were killed. And in Orissa, it was 105. In Andhra Pradesh, it was 18. But the good news is that when you look at 2020, to the extent that figures were made available, in Chhattisgarh, the number of those who were neutralized, extremists come terrorists, is 31. In Orissa, it is 13. And in AP, it is 0. So this is pointing to a declining trend. But I want to again underline that when we talk about the LWE, it is not to be seen purely as a case of those people who have picked up arms who need to be eliminated. They are citizens of India who, for whatever reason, feel deprived and therefore they have taken recourse to the gun. Yes, some of them may have been misguided ideologically or otherwise, but the state cannot abdicate and just deal with this as a security issue. There are gaps in the development effort, and most experts believe that this has to go hand in hand. That while the authority of the state should not be allowed to be challenged and left unchecked, at the same time there has to be an empathetic approach. Unfortunately, and I think this is one of the big gaps as far as the Indian security canvas is concerned, that whether it is the tribals or those who have become part of LWE, I think the state has not been able to provide the kind of development and empathy that is required. And we can only hope that as we go into 2021 and beyond, that this would be addressed. But as I said, if we look at the internal security, Northeast is one, LWE is the other, and the third is the kind of violence and terrorism that we relate to the religious fervor, particularly what is often described as the jihadi variant of terror, which began in 1990, as I said, post-Afghanistan, and it has its own complex history. But why I'm flagging that is that more recently, there have been reports about the equivalent of whether we talk about terror groups, sleeper cells, or the emergence of the Islamic State and its own ideology. Because it has occasionally manifested itself as brutal killings and violence. Recently, a couple of years ago, we had the Sri Lanka incident, where because of technology, because of internet, because of cyber indoctrination, there were some, the word that is often used is misguided, but some elements, some individuals who decided to take the path of violence. Now, this is a serious issue for India because I keep repeating this. You cannot have an Indian citizen living in fear of terror. And this is something I think that needs to be acknowledged. And therefore, when we talk about the Indian security compulsion, it straddles this very wide spectrum wherein there is the macro, there is the traditional, and there is the equivalent of the micro or the internal security issues, which come in different forms. So very broadly, I think, in conclusion, what I would say is that if we talk about India and its security challenges, there are some elements that are going to remain abiding. And to my mind, my personal view, I think China is going to be the most significant. Not just about Ladakh and what is happening there in terms of the standoff between the two militaries, but the Chinese presence in India. Because if we talk about these two neighbors, China and India, my personal reading is that it appears that the current leadership in China, led by President Xi Jinping, is trying to impose its own will on India in such a manner to demonstrate that in Asia, China would be the number one power and that all the other countries, whether it is in India or a Japan, would have to accept this particular profile of China. Now, we are aware that in the last 4 years, the United States, led by President Donald Trump, had a completely different view of China, and they saw China not only as an adversary, but as someone, as an entity, as a country that was disrupting global peace. Now, we are not sure how the presidency of Mr. Joe Biden is going to deal with China. The US-China relationship would have a very significant bearing on India's own security profile, both regional and global, and how China is going to position itself. And not only is it about, as I said, the land borders, but Chinese presence in the neighborhood. We have already discussed or spoken about how the China Pakistan nexus, strategic cooperation, has had an adverse impact on India's overall security. Today, we are witnessing a situation where in 2020, for example, China has made significant inroads into the neighborhood, whether we talk about not just Pakistan, as I said, you can leave that aside. You look at Bangladesh, you look at Nepal, you look at Sri Lanka, the Chinese presence is there. Similarly, China in the Indian Ocean. So, India would have to keep this in mind that not only is it China's economic and other capabilities that allow the equivalent of deep pockets of China to make inroads into the South Asian neighborhood, but whether this presence is going to be inimical to India in the long run is something that India would have to ponder over. And concurrently, I think the China challenge is global in terms of its economic profile. Because if China is going to become the world's number one economy by 2027-28, India and the rest of the world cannot be oblivious to how do they engage with China economically. Today, India has a dilemma, like other countries. China is an important trading partner for India. China is an important trading partner for Japan. China is an important trading partner for the United States. How do you manage the contradiction in the security and strategic domain while maintaining a certain level of economic trade and related contact? So I think when we look at the overall picture and review India's security challenges, I would conclude by saying that it is going to test India's perspicacity at the policy level in dealing with a depleted economic financial capability and yet being able to find the resources to deal with a complex set of challenges in which both COVID and China will differently manifest themselves.